I'm a planner, so I'm going to talk about fiscal planning today. We've had some very serious discussions here about the difficult choices that Illinois has, but Illinois also does not do a very good job of fiscal planning either. So there are some areas that Illinois could make some changes. Last February, a national think tank called the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities conducted a 50-state study that graded states' use of 10 budgetary tools. These tools are considered to be best practices that governments use to plan for the future and to manage their finances in a responsible way. In the study, the states were graded and received a score from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest possible score, and Illinois only scored 4 out of 10, which was well below average with respect to the use of these budgetary tools. Only 6 states scored as low as or lower than Illinois. I don't think it is a coincidence that Illinois happens to be a state with one of the worst fiscal situations in the United States. We have the worst underfunded pensions systems, and we have the lowest bond rating of any state. And also, Illinois scored so poorly with respect to the use of these budgetary and fiscal planning tools. So today I'm going to talk about the 5 areas where Illinois could improve and learn from other states that use these planning tools successfully. These areas are long-term forecasting, current services baseline projections, consensus revenue forecasts, fiscal notes, and rainy day funds. So we all know that state budgets change over time due to economic conditions and population growth, changes at the federal level, and other factors. Planning for fiscal sustainability begins with estimating the historical trends of different types of revenues and expenditures, and then projecting these growth rates into the future. Currently, the state of Illinois does not prepare long-term forecasts. Since fiscal 2012, the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability and the Governor's Office have developed 3-year budget projections of just the general fund budget, though, which is about half of the state's total budget. There are no projections for revenues and expenditures that fall outside of the general funds budget, which is much of what we spend on Medicare, for instance, comes from special funds, but also the state motor fuel tax revenues don't go into the general fund, and also the Department of Transportation budget is completely outside of the general fund. So ideally, there would be a 10-year projection of the total budget issued every year. As you can see on the slide, I've shown you what the Fiscal Futures Project here at the University of Illinois Institute of Government and Public Affairs does. We have provided unofficial long-term forecasts of Illinois' revenues and spending for the last 5 years. And as you can see in our slide, our forecast shows expenditures growing faster than revenues over the long term, which does add up over time. The second area is what's known as a current services baseline estimate, which is just an estimate of the cost of continuing a particular program in its current form without making any changes for at least 1 year in the future. We know that even if a program doesn't change, there will probably be some cost increases from 1 year to the next due to things like inflation or salaries or changes in the number of people being served. These factors would all be included in a current services baseline projection, meaning that this is the amount we need to budget for the next year and possibly the next several years, ideally, if we aren't going to make any cuts to the program. As you can see in the slide, what I've shown is an excerpt of the Illinois operating budget that was Governor Quinn's budget from earlier this spring. And as you can see, it shows line item allocations for agencies and for programs with columns on the left for actual spending in the prior year, fiscal 2013. The center column shows estimated current year spending for fiscal 2014, and then the recommended, or in the red, not recommended appropriation for the following year. But these numbers are all listed in nominal dollars, so this isn't really the same as a current services baseline projection, which would show lawmakers and the public whether a proposed budget reflects a real spending cut or a real increase, again in real terms. So the third area that Illinois could improve is in their use of revenue forecasting. A consensus revenue forecast is one that is endorsed by both branches of government, the legislative and the executive branch. Consensus revenue forecasts are prepared in 27 states, but in Illinois, each branch of government prepares its own revenue estimates. What I've shown in the slide is an excerpt from the annual revenue report that is produced by the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability, and they show their estimate alongside the governor's office estimates. And the concern that people have with respect to the fact that there's two different forecasts and there's two sets of numbers is the fact that it becomes then a political issue, and instead of discussing how we're going to spend the resources that we do have, we get into a political debate about whose numbers are correct. Some states go farther and adopt a binding revenue forecast in which there are mid-year corrections if spending is increasing and going over the amount that was agreed to be spent in terms of the revenue forecast. But Illinois doesn't go that far either. The fourth area where Illinois could really improve is in its use of fiscal notes. Fiscal notes are statements that accompany a bill, and they detail the costs or savings or revenues associated with the legislation. Some even provide projections of future impacts. While some states prepare fiscal notes for a majority of bills, or at least a majority of the significant bills, Illinois is seriously deficient in this area. Illinois is one of just 11 states with very poor practices with respect to fiscal notes. Even worse, the use of fiscal notes in Illinois has declined steadily over the past decade. In the 98th legislative session that just ended, of the bills that reached second reading, which is the point where fiscal notes can be attached, only about 3% were accompanied by fiscal notes. In contrast, 10 years ago in the 2003-2004 legislative session, 11% had fiscal notes. Because the preparation of fiscal notes can delay a bill's progress through the legislature, fiscal notes may be requested by a bill's opponents as a way to kill the legislation before it's called for a vote. However, some states prepare fiscal notes long before the bill reaches second reading, which means that the time needed to perform the technical analysis does not delay the bill's progress, and this essentially takes the politics out of the situation with respect to fiscal notes. Improving and increasing the amount of information that's available to legislators when they vote on a bill would be a relatively simple way to improve Illinois' budget process and even possibly fiscal condition. The last area where Illinois could really improve is in the use of the rainy day fund. Illinois is one of only just 4 states identified in the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities study that do not have a well-designed rainy day fund, which is just simply a system of cash reserves that can be used to stabilize a state's finances in the event of an economic downturn, which we pretty well know that is going to happen. Things go up and then they go down in a cycle. So let's plan for the cycle. Illinois does have a fund called the Budget Stabilization Fund, which was established in 2000. In a typical year, the Budget Stabilization Fund, as I've shown on the slide, the excerpt from the Comptroller's website where you can look up the information about the Budget Stabilization Fund, and in a typical year it's used to transfer about $270 million back and forth between itself and the General Revenue Fund. That may sound like a lot of money, but it's minuscule compared to the size of the total state budget, which is about $65 billion. Currently, according to the Comptroller's website, as I show on the slide, the balance in the Budget Stabilization Fund is only about $740,000, which is about 1/1000th of 1% of the total state budget. In order to be effective, some experts recommend that a government's rainy day reserves would equal 10 to 15% of its total budget. For Illinois, this would suggest keeping about $10 billion in a reserve fund. In conclusion, Illinois has a chronic structural fiscal problem that's so great that its budget deficits can't be eliminated by increases in economic growth alone or by the recent changes that were made to the state retirement systems that may have to be redone again. So improving the state's budgetary practices would be one relatively simple way to at least help improve its fiscal outcome going forward. We can put systems in place that would force policymakers to plan for economic cycles and changing demographics in order not to get caught aware when these things do occur. Better financial information, clearly presented, is essential to intelligent, thoughtful planning for Illinois' future, so that we don't keep repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past.